Welcome to today's episode of the Oxford Smart Space Series. This series provides a platform for experts, scholars, and thought leaders to discuss topics around the intersection of space and the social sciences, sharing insights on opportunities and challenges. Today's episode focuses on the relevance of space in achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Space plays a vital role in advancing sustainable development by providing valuable tools, data, and insights to enhance our understanding of Earth and its ecosystems. From climate monitoring and disaster response to resource management and connectivity, space-based solutions offer immense potential for promoting social, economic, and environmental well-being. We're grateful to our esteemed speakers for sharing their expertise and insights with us today. Their knowledge and perspectives will undoubtedly enrich our understanding of how space can be harnessed to achieve the SDGs, guiding policy and shaping practical solutions for a better future. I encourage you all to ask thought-provoking questions and share your valuable insights in the chat box. We'll begin with questions for the panel, then open to questions to the audience. My name's Dimiana Farag, and I'll be your host for today. To shed light on this important topic, we're privileged to have distinguished speakers joining us today. Shelli Brunswick, the Chief Operating Officer at Space Foundation. She brings a broad perspective and deep vision of the global space ecosystem, from a distinguished career as a space acquisition and program management leader and congressional liaison for the US Air Force, to her current role overseeing Space Foundation's three primary divisions: the Center for Innovation and Education, Symposium 365, and Global Alliance. Advocating for space technology innovation, entrepreneurship, diversity, and inclusion, she collaborates with organizations around the world to connect commercial, government, and educational sectors. Shelli plays an active leadership role with various international organizations, such as Space for Women Mentoring Program, an affiliate of the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, Women Tech Network, G100 Global Chair for Space Technology and Aviation, and many more. Dr. Samira Barzin is a geospatial economic analyst at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. Prior to that, she was an Oxford Martin Fellow with the Mathematical Institute at the University of Oxford. She develops pioneering work at the intersection of economic analyses and geospatial intelligence. Her work focuses on finding solutions to the double challenge of economic development and climate change for developing countries, often in direct collaboration with policymakers. She works very closely with various teams at the World Bank, in particular with the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery and the Sustainable Development teams to support them directly with novel geospatial analyses. Samira holds a PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Imperial College London, a Master's in Economics from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a Master's in Economics and Finance from the University of Aberdeen. Pat Mathewson is the head of business analysis at Astroscale, the first private company dedicated to the safe and sustainable development of space. He's an economist by background and has previously served as an economic consultant with London Economic Space Team, conducting analysis on behalf of national governments and multilateral space agencies. Prior to this, he was a country economist with the International Growth Center, supporting development policy in sub-Saharan Africa and fragile states. He holds a master's in public and economic policy with distinction from the London School of Economics and a master's in economics and international relations from the University of St. Andrews. Once again, welcome to the Oxford Smart Space Series episode on Space for Good, Engaging the SDGs for Policy and Practice. Let us embark on this exciting journey together and explore the infinite possibilities that space offers in achieving a sustainable and inclusive future. And now, without further ado, we'll begin with our panelists. We'll start with Shelli, then Samira, and then Pat. Our first question for today, and welcome: what are the examples from your experience and work of successful space-based initiatives that have contributed to achieving the UN SDGs? And what can we learn from these examples to inform future policies and practice?
Well, I'd like to first of all start by saying thank you so much for inviting me to It's such a pleasure to be here. As we look at what the SDGs are and what their goal is, they were created in 2015 to solve our sustainability challenges by 2030. So we do have a long way to go, but space is a central part of creating that sustainability. One great place to look at is the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs. When you go to their website, they have a drop-down menu with all the SDGs and how space is part of every one of those sustainable development goals. Some of the examples that I've seen personally and that we do here at Space Foundation is gender equality and collaboration and equality in educational activities. So we do that through a number of our programs and processes. And we do that through partnerships and collaboration because no one organization can solve the SDGs alone. We have to do that together. And so some of those organizations we work with as we look at space science to solve the challenges here on planet Earth, we are partnered with the Organization of American States and the Islamic World Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or ISESCO, and the African Union Commission. And we're looking at how we partner with other organizations to bring ideas and space science and tech transfer from the space industry to emerging countries that are emerging in the space industry. And many times when people hear space and sustainability, they think about going to the moon and Mars. But I really want to close that development lamp by saying that when we think about moon Mars, we also need to think about tech transfer and how that technology benefits us every day. And some key areas as we look at some of the first sustainable development goals. Zero hunger. We're looking at space application, whether it's freeze-dried technology, Earth observation from satellites helping farmers in Africa increase their crop yield, or vertical farming. We're using space technology to solve parts of that sustainable development goal. And we can look at water and sustainable energy and so on. So space is an integral part of solving the sustainable development goals. And I'd love to hear more from our other speakers. So I look forward to the next question and further dialogue. So thank you again.
Thanks, Shelli. Samira.
So actually, I'm going to continue with some of the bits that Shelli mentioned. So a lot of the issues that we face in the world, also specifically in developing countries, are a little bit tricky to answer in the absence of reliable data. So how does a policy look like to secure food for everyone if we don't actually know what food is produced in a country and where? And especially in developing countries, there's a lot of subsistence agriculture. Now, certain crops are more vulnerable to climate change than others. So crop switching, for example, switching from traditional crops to crops that can deal better with the changing climate is a huge part of climate adaptation in developing countries. But it all starts with understanding what happens and what happens where. And we oftentimes do not have that luxury in developing countries. So how do we answer the SDGs in developing countries, but also to a lesser degree in developed countries? Because for those, we generally have a good data infrastructure if we don't know what is the status of the moment. So if we wanted to answer the SDG, it all starts with understanding the world as it is now, so we can understand where are the rest. So how do we go from the ideas of an SDG into a policy? So that's a lot of the work I do, and I work with the World Bank and the UK government and a few other players to really try to find a way to go from the idea of one of the many SDGs to a viable policy, and how that policy is embedded in the data structure, and how data advances from remote sensing can help us actually achieve and design policies that help us actually succeed in achieving the SDGs, whether that's looking at yields and harvest, whether that's looking at deforestation, whether that's looking at air pollution, coastal erosion. Satellites can really help us, and remote sense data fill a crucial data gap. We can actually achieve the SDGs and go from an idea to a policy.
Thanks, Samira. Pat, we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me here today. To Shelli's point, most of human activity today is focused not on the moon or Mars in space, but our activities in space are focused here on Earth. And to Samira's point, you can't manage what you can't measure. The data that we generate from space is incredibly important for things like managing climate change. We see really interesting applications from novel space companies like Hawkeye 360, looking at illegal fishing, satellite view, looking at heat leak from buildings, trying to manage sustainable building structures around the world. But we have a core issue, and we're going to go through some fairly elegant solutions that are being developed off the back of space-based technology. But what we don't realize is that virtually everyone on this call today has already used space in some way or form, whether it was from a timestamp on a financial transaction or a 5G connection, or whether it was through food that you had delivered to your home or a grocery store through a global supply chain. Space has touched you in some way today. And this hardware, the backbone of this technology that's providing applications that better our lives and have the opportunity to improve human flourishing and human prosperity, is under threat, because currently our model of space technology is built off the back of hardware that is not sustainable. We are generating debris in our orbits that pose a threat to the ongoing exploitation of those. Small pieces of debris, some as small as a coin, traveling 17,000 miles an hour. It's like a small bullet, and if it hits any of the satellites that are generating these insights, the type of work that Samira does can't be done. The type of work that NGOs and the UN are trying to do can't be done. So we need to pay attention if we want to maintain these insights and benefit Earth and benefit both developed and developing nations. We have to pay attention to our orbits and make sure that we design spacecraft and design policy that leads to a sustainable space environment over time.
Thanks, Pat. This is such valuable information, and each one of you, through your work, have collaborated with various different stakeholders, which SDG 17 focuses on partnerships. I'd love to learn from you, based on what you've shared and the work that your organizations do and your previous experiences, as to what are some examples of collaborations that you've observed between private sector, governments, academia, NGOs, and other stakeholders to leverage space-based technologies and data for social good? And what are some key challenges and opportunities in this area that can be addressed moving forward? And we'll start with reverse. Pat, why don't you go ahead first?
So I've mentioned two of them so far. So one was in illegal fishing, and another one was in looking at buildings and heat leak. How can you optimize buildings? It's one of the biggest impacts we can make as individuals on our carbon footprint and our impact on climate. There's quite a few that you'll see in developing contexts around agricultural yields. How do you look at things like locust swarms or improving agricultural productivity? There's plenty of interesting applications, but one of the key problems that you run into regularly is that there is a huge quantity of data that's currently being produced by commercial and government satellite systems. But often just the mere provision of this data doesn't necessarily mean it makes a difference on the ground. You need the connection between that ground truth and the data and matching in between to make sure you get a productive application and insights that are actually valuable. And in terms of dispersing this and making it more widely used within the SDGs or within development goals, there's a need for an intermediary layer. There's an individual named Aravind over at TerraWatch who I think articulates this really well, that one of the developments that has to arise for this, for satellite data to continue to be used for social good and to really meet its promise, is there is a layer of individuals that need to both understand the context in which these challenges are arising and the data itself that's coming from satellite systems. And that's an area that needs to mature. And we need to better understand how we can apply and give thought to context and make sure the insights are actually valuable from a policymaker and end user point of view.
Thanks, Pat. And Samira.
So just to follow up from what Pat said, so we have a really big bottleneck that we do have a lot of imagery now, but we don't have imagery that's reliably labeled. So in order to scale up models and to really predict something on a global or larger scale, we actually need not just images, but we need to tell the computer what these images mean. So currently, the bottleneck is not the imagery, but the amount of reliably labeled imagery by ground truth data. So that's one of the bottlenecks currently, but another one in the implementation is often that when I talk to policymakers, that they're incredibly fascinated by what I tell them, but I might be the first one to tell them. Whereas if I talk to innovators, whether that's the geospatial services at Google or others, they say we have these incredibly rich data, but we don't see a large take up, especially not from the policy world. And why is that? So there's a big inefficiency in ensuring that people who can actually use the data understand that the data exists. And they also need to learn how to leverage the data, because the data world and then the policy world, which is the bridge that I'm working in, it's two separate worlds with different vocabulary and different ways of thinking. So there's really an efficiency of two worlds not intermingling sufficiently, because it's a big switch from the policy world to rely on information that is generated by statistical authorities to data that's actually predominantly generated through the private sector, because that's where a lot of the geospatial innovation happens. So a big inefficiency just arises with people that could actually leverage the data to design policies, not knowing that the data exists, whereas the people that build data not being quite clear on how their data needs to be packaged for policymakers. So that's one of the biggest inefficiencies that I see, and one that I personally directly work on to reduce that inefficiency in the system, so the data that's generated can actually answer the questions that we have.
And Shelli, building on that.
Fantastic. What I'll do is kind of give some concrete examples of how we can have that team collaboration with public-private partnership. And one example is my good friend, Dr. Catherine Nakalibi, who's a assistant professor at the University of Maryland. And she is the African program director under the NASA Harvest and a member of NASA Surveyor applied science teams, which she uses this to provide agriculture and food security thematic lead. And she was the 2020 African Food Prize laureate for her dedication to improving the lives of small farmers by using satellite technology to harness data to guide agricultural decision making. And her efforts have also promoted the formulations of policies and programs that directly impact farmers against the impacts of food failure. So you can see a concrete example of how someone, whether it's in South America or Africa or Asia, may not see how space benefits them by working together with government agencies. In this case, NASA, the U.S. State Department, it could be ESA, with academia, because she's out of the University of Maryland, but also then partnering with local NGOs in Africa, in Dr. Catherine's case, to provide that real-time data to farmers to increase crop yield, or the worst case scenario that crops might fail. So a real tangible way. Another one I want to recommend is David Thomas from the Milo Institute, which is a nonprofit research collaborative led by Arizona State University with support from Lockheed Martin. So again, you see academia in private industry, but their goal is to inspire, build, and explore. So the Milo Institute makes space accessible to all. It has a mission academy that supports development of a skilled and capable workforce, a payload accelerator, and guides teams from spacefaring nations from concept and payload development to mission operations. So again, when we think about space, we're talking about space coming back to Earth, but here is an organization that is willing to help universities or countries or communities create a payload and get it launched into space and have space access. And so their mission is to support members throughout the entire process of creating that payload and getting it launched. So again, I'll wait for the next question. I'll share some of the examples about Space Foundation, but I wanted to highlight just a couple examples of that public-private partnership, whether it's academia, industry, government, and that global impact that when we work together, the challenges that we can solve together. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been such rich information that we're understanding of the challenges and specific examples that need to be addressed, which is a perfect segue to the next question of what are the potential risks and ethical considerations associated with the use of satellite data for sustainable development, and how can these risks be mitigated and ethical standards upheld? Why don't we start with Samira this time?
So for the work that I do, the biggest issue that we have is the people that write algorithms might not be the people that come from the domain. So because my background is economics, I can understand data in the context of economics. Now, I would be very careful in making a claim that I understand agriculture data, for example, because I am not an ecologist. But I think that the biggest issue is that we need to understand that the people that build models are not necessarily those that can actually understand the models. Now, that can be extremely dangerous. If you don't know what you're modeling, you might be modeling either just noise, or you might actually be introducing a bias into your algorithm. So if we want to think of the information that we have from ground truth labels, now if our ground truth is biased, then our algorithms will also spit out biased information. Now, because that is a big bottleneck, that is the ground truth data, we have to be really aware and hypersensitive to the biases that we introduce into our models, because otherwise effectively we deliver models that are biased. So that's a big part in understanding what do we model, who do we model it for, and what are the risks, and could, even though if we do something in good faith, could that be misconstrued to actually do something bad. Now, if we think of illegal fishing, of course we want to fight illegal fishing, but what are the considerations that we should be having if it's actually smallholder fishing and it's someone's income that we are attacking? So there's a big risk there to just look at space-based and remote sense information without embedding them into the socioeconomic system within which that data is embedded, and from what the information is actually trying to tell us. So the absence of domain knowledge in the world of large geospatial analytics can be extremely harmful if we don't pay attention to what we are doing and what does it actually mean that we're doing. So the reflection on that it is not just data, but it's actually people's lives that we're looking at is fundamental.
Thank you, Samira. That was really, it's important to see with our zeal for economic development and trying to make the world a better place, we could inadvertently cause harm in some cases. So we'll move to Shelli.
Well, thank you again. I really want to think about the ethics of space and access to it. And so, one of the things I always highlight is last year, the global space economy was $467 billion. 77% of that is commercial. And that global space economy is going to grow to 1 trillion by 2030, 3 trillion by 2040. And we think about technology, space is already all technology. It's healthcare, it's energy, it's AI, VR. It's already part of everything we're doing. And it's in every sector of the economy, from agriculture, as we've already highlighted, energy, manufacturing, finance, education, public safety, transportation, and more. So space is already permeated throughout our entire economies around the world. So the question I have now is, how do we ensure that everyone has access to that opportunity? And that's where Space Foundation is very passionate about creating that workforce pipeline, because when you create workforce capacity, you unlock economic opportunity. So our partnerships with organizations like ISESCO and the African Union and Organization of American States is really looking at how we build that workforce that can benefit and harness space technology to then create opportunities, whether they want to create those opportunities off planet or on planet. So it's really about breaking down those barriers and the perceptions. There are perceptions that people say, well, space is not for me, space is for those other countries or other people. But really, there's space opportunities for everyone, from high school graduates to PhDs and everyone in between. And how we can harness that space technology can unlock innovation, entrepreneurship, and help to solve our sustainable development challenges. Think about it. When we have internet-based satellite internet-based access, think about all the remote users that now have access to join an economic opportunity, to join creating solutions and ideas and new ways of doing business and opportunities. We bring them into the global collective. It's a way of creating inclusion by creating these space-based technologies and allowing others to have them, because we create access and opportunity, and new ideas can help us solve our biggest challenges here on Earth. So I'm looking forward to having some more of the dialogue. We look forward to your questions, so keep sending those in, and back over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Shelli. So we've covered responsible use of data, now access to data, to the space technology, and even education. Within that, Pat, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, I think I very much agree with Samira on this one, and that particularly from an inside the space industry perspective, there's we need to always be careful to have humility in these situations and the application of these systems. So you may spend $1 billion or more on a platform, and you have a big hammer, and every problem starts to look like a nail. When simple ground truth data, as has been evidenced time and time again in developing settings, there's some great examples from Uganda and elsewhere where simple open source geolocation data on things like water sources, etc., complement or even improve upon what you could get from a satellite source. So just making sure that there's always that linking between ground truth and novel techniques delivered through satellite systems. But as we talk about data, you might also think about provision of data. So we see there's strong evidence of spillovers for when you have local entities dealing with EO and building with EO applications in developing settings. When they move on to other firms, we see evidence of spillovers, which might give you reason to think that there is an under-provision from a social optimum point of view. So as developed governments and commercial entities think about how you could add value in a developing context to meet SDGs, what does provision of data look like? How can you overcome the major barriers in terms of acquisition, and then also skill transfer and training to ensure that people are able to engage effectively with? Because not only will they then have the ability to take that data and apply their local knowledge to that, but then also you might see direct economic benefit as they spill over into other firms or other places.
Thanks, Pat. I think we have room for one more question, which I think will also be a great segue to the conversation moving forward. What are the most promising areas for future investment and innovation in the space sector to further support the SDGs? SDGs are ending in 2030. The clock is ticking. And so what do you see as most essential now that could help further achieve the SDGs? And then we'll move to questions right after this. So let's start with Pat.
So I think some of the major investments here, involve thinking about how do we deal with the quantity of data that's currently being generated. It's more than any human eyes, even if everyone on the planet was reviewing all the time on a daily basis, that we'd be able to work through. So we're going to have to use machine learning and AI techniques to sift through this and to generate insights. There's a huge amount of value there. But again, also those investments in the intermediary layer. What does it look like to have people that actually know how to apply this in context that can help governments, can help NGOs, and can help facilitate the application of this data in very specific settings. So insofar as we can think about how those are created and generated and supported by international finance, that would be great.
Great, thanks, Pat. Samira, would you like to add to that?
I'm just going to follow up on that because that's quite directly in line with what I think. We have huge amounts of data and we have an inefficiency of some degree where we don't see people. Like you have a lot of startups that have great ideas, say, I will contribute and I will, contribute to the SDGs and to sustainability. But then how do these startups actually see their ideas materializing into actually achieving any of the SDGs that we have set out to achieve? Or is it just a grand mission, but without a clear abscess of how the innovation can actually then result in changes that we so urgently need? Another thing that I think is extremely important going forward. Now, one of the things I think are fascinating is if we could do remote sensed advances in the context of nature. So whether that's biodiversity or nature recovery, those are extremely important questions. However, biodiversity, for example, extremely difficult to measure remotely sense, because biodiversity in the savannah will look completely different to a forest in Sweden. Now, what I think could we really take that discussion forward is people that develop remote sensed instruments and sit within the development of those actually work together with, in this context, ecologists. So we really need a much better interlinkages between domain knowledge experts that actually would then also be the end user of the data generated and those developing the instruments. So the instruments can then actually, in fact, measure those metrics that we still need in order to design better policies. So a better integration between those people developing technologies and the end user and domain knowledge experts, I think, is extremely fundamental. And I really hope that could happen, because I think that that would really push the discussion forward, rather than instruments being developed and then end users trying to find a way to work with them. So I think a better integration of domain knowledge directly within the context of development of space-based instruments is extremely fundamental.
Thanks, Samira and Shelli.
Fantastic. I'm going to highlight the need to really unlock innovation and entrepreneurship around the globe. We have amazing innovators and entrepreneurs, but many times they're finding their way in, whether it's ideation or what they can harness. And a great resource is the NASA Tech Transfer Office. There are thousands of patents that NASA has that are waiting to be commercialized, from energy and energy storage solutions to agriculture and water and healthcare, that can be commercialized. And the great thing is you can apply for these patents, and sometimes you can apply for a development grant to help bring these products to market. And the US is not the only one who has this treasure. ESA, the European Space Agency, also has a tech transfer office, as well as the Japanese Space Agency. So a lot of the opportunities, there was investments made in space exploration that have now benefited us here on Earth, such as fire retardant clothing for firefighters, or even the way we're talking today. Telecommunications is all brought to us thanks to space technology. But there are patents that are now waiting for entrepreneurs to unharness. And the biggest thing we can do is help to facilitate that entrepreneurship, provide those entrepreneurs with the facilitation, the skills, the networks, and the resources, the funding, so that they can create the next great innovation that helps solve our challenges here on Earth. So again, that starts not only with adults today, but we at Space Foundation, as well as many others, such as Out of the Box from Israel, have entrepreneurial programs that start as early as middle school, because we need to start creating entrepreneurs as young as possible who think creatively, who think outside the box, and want to solve big problems and challenges. So I'm looking forward to some of the questions that we've received. So back over to you.
Thanks, Shelli. And we've got a number of questions coming in. Two are similar, and I think they're to your point earlier, Shelli, specific to access. And Samira and Pat, please do chime in. These are from Nils Wendt and Jacopo. Nils is in Munich, and Jacopo is joining from Milan. And so the questions are around access. What does better access look like? And what could we do to lower the access barriers to the use of space data? So Shelli, why don't you start with that the question, and then Samira and Pat, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, I looked at the question. There were two parts. What could better access to space look like, as well as what could we do to lower the barriers? So at Space Foundation, we have a workforce development roadmap. So we always look at how do we have a step-by-step process to achieve our end goals. And there's a 5 steps. That's awareness, access, training, connecting, and mentoring. And that first step is awareness. People have to be aware that there are opportunities, whether those opportunities are in the space industry or the aviation industry, because we're short workers in the aviation industry as well, not just pilots, but flight attendants, mechanics, etc. So we are short workforce across the board. But that first step is awareness. People have to know that there are opportunities. What are those opportunities and how do they find them? So again, internet is a good way. That second step is creating that access point. How do you break through and punch through that barrier, find a way into that area you want to be if it's in the space industry? So those could be, again, I talked about the NASA Tech Transfer Office. That could be a way to find a great idea that you could commercialize, bring to market. You could apply for a small business innovative research grant from the US government to help commercialize that process. And that could be an access point. The United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs has many conferences and opportunities. That could be an access point. That third step is about training, and that training could be formal and informal. If you want to be an astronaut or a rocket scientist, you're going to need a formal training and degree. If you want to be an entrepreneur, it could be somewhere in between. I heard Peter Beck, he gave an interview a couple months ago, and he said NASA wouldn't give him a job, so he decided to create a rocket company. So, you know, entrepreneurship is one of the hardest jobs in the world, being an entrepreneur, but it could be also one of the most rewarding. So look at entrepreneurship, and that could be formal or informal. You could have a college education. Obviously, you know, if you want to create a rocket, you might want a formal education or you hire people. But you could also take entrepreneurial programs to help you get there, and those could be informal. You could look at fellowship programs or internships. I know UNUSA's Space for Women is looking for a new intern to help with that program. So there's lots of ways to get education. You could even volunteer. That fourth step is about networks. So no matter what industry you want to be in, there are formal organizations that help connect that industry with like-minded individuals. So in addition to being in the space industry, I'm also a program manager. So I belong to Project Management Institute, so PMI. But in the space industry, you can join Women in Aerospace, UNUSA Space for Women, or Space for Youth, or Space for Water, lawyers. They have programs. You could also look at Space Symposium is a great event that we put on at Space Foundation. Through the Space Generation Advisory Council, they do a 2-day Fusion Forum program where they bring thought leaders together. So you could find some of these organizations that have like-minded people, and you start building your network and connections, and that creates opportunity. And that fifth step can really help you overcome the other four opportunities, and that is mentoring. Finding a mentor can help you find awareness, create an access point, learn about training, and build your network. And mentoring can be different varieties. It could be coaching, which is a life coach across your entire career and journey, or it could be focused in a certain specific area, or it could be a champion that helps position you for the next job. So look for a multitude of role models and mentors, and you can also be a mentor at any step of your career and help someone else accomplish their goals. So again, that's awareness, access, training, connecting, and mentoring. Back over to you.
Thanks, Shelli. And Samira and Pat, would you like to add to what Shelli shared?
Sure. Well, insofar as we're talking about space for development, if your goal is access to space to generate the value of space, and if we're thinking for developing nations or developing contexts, I think one important thing to be aware of is the illusion or the siren song of hardware that you need, that a nation might think it needs its own sovereign capability in terms of its own satellite system or its own satellite constellation. And I don't think that's true. The availability of commercial data, a lot of this market is saturated in terms of the hardware being out there and available. If a developing nation or an NGO is going to devote capital to a well-focused Space for Good program, really focusing on skills, on the availability of procuring that data, focusing on the downstream and how you elevate the context to that data is a much more effective path, I think, at this point in time. So it's something to be mindful of as you're thinking of a strategy, if you might be within one of those organizations or within one of those nations.
Thanks, Pat. Samira, do you want to chime in on this?
Sure. Also, foremost, I apologize. There might be some hammering going on a little bit in the background, but hopefully not while I speak. I think some of the most important questions that we have in terms of ensuring that no one is left behind is not just the technical aspect of it. I think it comes also down big time to humble communications. And I've been asked before, if when I work with policymakers from developing countries and I come with big fancy machine learning tools, what is the reaction that I get? And I said almost always, actually without exception, I get very positive feedback, because I don't come from a point that I imply that I know better what's going on in any given place, whether that's Jakarta or Hanoi. But I'm just there to complement the existing local knowledge, because there will always be certain metrics that we cannot infer from a satellite. It's not easy, for example, to infer political attitudes from a satellite, because we cannot look into people's head. We can't even look into people's houses. So I think it also has it has to come from a humble point and great communication skills to really show how technical innovation, in this case, spaceborne technical innovation, can contribute, but not there to crowd out existing knowledge, but rather to complement and strengthening existing knowledge, so that then the knowledge that we generate actually makes sense and is being taken up by local policymakers. So I think that's a big part. And a lot of when you look, for example, at Maxar, when there's a disaster, oftentimes they release a lot of their data for emergency mapping, so that we can identify buildings that were destructed or infrastructure that was destructed. So there's a lot of goodwill from big tech to contribute. And it really has to come from a point that we want to contribute to solve issues rather than we want to dominate the market. So I think that the messaging is really quite important, and the communication too, if we want to bring people into this rather than exclude people from this discussion.
Couldn't agree more. I think it's even in the entire holistic context of space, I think the messaging, there's a bit of a disconnect between those that are experts in the sector versus anyone from the general public. So our next question actually applies to all of you. It's from Andreas in Hamburg. And Andreas is asking, public-private partnerships, are there success stories? I often see rather problems, for example, bureaucracy. So we'll start, Pat, from your experience with Astroscale and beyond. What would you say you would share as far as success stories?
For sure. I mean, I think there's a great example in the UK government's UKSA's program, IPP, which I think is the International Partnerships Program, which involved helping to push space applications and trade in between the UK and developing contexts. And there's some great reporting and some great analysis you can read on this, but the gains from trade and side-by-side learning seem to be lasting in this. So that's not to say you build an enormous government apparatus and bureaucracy, but if you give the opportunities for that language, for that information exchange, that learning exchange, you can really see the benefits reaped. There's great opportunity for learning by doing that can benefit the SDGs and benefit these objectives.
Great, thanks, Pat. Shelli.
Absolutely. I think when we think about public-private partnerships, as we look at low Earth orbit, and for one, the U.S. government is no longer going to be in low Earth orbit. They believe that can now be commercialized. And that's really as we look at what is the role of government. The role of government is to take on things that have high risk. We're not sure what the reward is, especially when we look at research or information knowledge gathering from exploring the cosmos. So we can look back to when the U.S. passed, the opportunity for rocket companies to even come into existence. Before that, you had to be NASA or the U.S. Air Force to build a rocket and launch a rocket, maintain a rocket. Now we have multiple rocket companies that are doing that, which has now made it so the government just purchases a launch like it's a commercial off-the-shelf product. We're just going to buy a launch, we're going to put a payload on it, and we're going to launch it. And we can now see this public-private partnership now happening as we look at the International Space Station. It's projected to be decommissioned in 2030. What is going up in place? It's not going to be another government-run space station. NASA has awarded multiple contracts to private companies to look at commercializing that. And once again, the government will now rent space on that commercial space station, but it'll no longer be, the sole provider and managing it and doing the day-to-day operations. It's just one tenant of that. And you can see that in even satellites, where the US government would buy constellations of satellites, and now they're buying space on a launch vehicle for maybe launching a satellite or putting a sensor on another company's satellite payload. So there's different ways of doing business. And as we see the government change their methodology for how they're partnering with industry to create this, it's now unlocking opportunities for industry to now fill that opportunity and take off. And you can see that not only in low Earth orbit with satellites and space stations and rockets, but we're also seeing that on the moon. We're seeing partnerships for moon rovers, not just US moon rovers with General Motors and Lockheed Martin, but also Toyota and the Japanese Space Agency. So you're seeing a lot of opportunity for that public-private partnership, that collaboration to unlock opportunities for space exploration. But again, I highlight that there is a role for the government, and that is when it's related to things that are very risky, that are really for research and information. When we look at the James Webb Space Telescope, an amazing achievement by multiple governments and agencies, we can see the information and the pictures that are coming back that tell us about the earliest moments of our universe. That is an amazing thing for our government to invest in. Because when I look back to what we invested in for Hubble, our governments invested in Hubble, and one of the amazing tech transfer that came from Hubble was mammogram detection. Nobody would have thought mammogram detection would have came from launching the Hubble Space Telescope. But a company took that technology of looking into space for anomalies, and they use that now to look into the human body for anomalies. So when we invest in space, we are really investing in humanity here on planet Earth as well. So I just want to highlight that the government plays a critical role in investing in this innovation and funding it. And when the time is right and the risk comes down, there's an opportunity to partner with industry to hand that opportunity over to them. Back over to you.
Thanks, Shelli. That's wow. I mean, there's so much evidence there of success stories, but then there's also so much more that can be done. Samira, what would you please add?
Just to follow up from Shelli's point, if we think of some future considerations on space-based solar farming, the reason that we have a large take-up of solar panel infrastructure on Earth in this case is because of substantial subsidy programs by governments. So I think governments need to wake up on what could be possible in not just what could be possible, but also to enter the space of regulation. So I think those are two. There's a lot of opportunities in space, but there's also a lot of risk that if that space is not regulated, similar to if we think of the consideration that we have with AI and the large social network and online information, space also generates, a lot of information. So that needs to be equally regulated. So I think the bringing in the governments and governments, from personal experience, they're always a little bit lethargic, and they're not at that speed of development as big tech is, because they're big administrative entities that are a bit slow. They're highly complicated. There's a lot of fairness considerations, which the private sector doesn't have to do in that same dimension. So the importance to ensure that governments are part of the stories is hugely fundamental, which is both the communicating of what is possible in space, but equally what are the risks in space and what the role of the governments should be to harness the data innovation and the technology advantage that we are making, but equally also to regulate the risks so that we can actually maximize space for good as much as possible without getting too much of the disadvantages.
Thanks. So we have about 10 minutes left. So our next question quickly from Carlos is, why is it so difficult to agree on common policies on space debris? Who'd like to share insight on that? Pat, why don't you?
We'll take a stab at it. So I think one of the problems in the first instance that makes space debris so challenging is, unlike garbage in your community or garbage in your waterway, Space is not at your doorstep every day. You're not thinking about it. You think of space and you think of an incredibly vast place. And the idea that we could somehow fill it or pollute it is challenging. But we actually use a very thin band of space, just around, just above Earth. Mostly in low Earth orbit is where we have the majority of satellites at present. And currently we treat space like a garbage dump. We have a model of satellites, which is, say you had a car and you had a destination you were trying to go to and you went to it regularly, but every time you went, you got in the car, you drove it there, and you left it crashed in the middle of the road and didn't do anything about it afterward. So right now we've had these technologies which we have left satellites up there to collide into one another to produce more small, high-flying debris. And this is it's a challenge. We have a technological architecture that has led to this. Companies like Astroscale are trying to develop solutions for in-orbit servicing, including end-of-life removal, active debris removal, which captures satellites when they fail at the end of their lives and drags them back down to Earth. These technologies are critical, but it's also having an open dialogue and understanding value of space for things like the SDGs, for things like economic prosperity, and ensure that the voice of nations that are benefiting from these applications are in the debates about how we use space, are in the halls of power, and we discuss regulation around responsible use of space and space sustainability. So it's an education issue in the first instance, and then it's affecting suitable policies, economics, and technological developments to meet those problems.
Thanks, Pat. Shelli, Samira, we have a couple of other questions. So do you want to add to this question? Edgar can move on to the next one. All right. Next one has a little bit of a twist. It's a little different, and it also addresses the intersectionalities of the SDGs, I think, too. This is a question from Eric from Arizona, who's asking, in what ways does the space sector intersect with SDG 5, which is on gender equality, achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls? Why don't we start with Shelli?
Fantastic. Well, one of the things I want to highlight is I have a very good friend, Lumbi Malambo, and she grew up in Africa, and she would have to walk miles every day to get water for her family and then walk back. Now, today in Africa, women and girls are still having to do that. They may have to walk up to 10 miles one way. And because they're primarily getting the water for their families, it could also be contaminated, making them and their animals sick. And then it also can prevent them from going to school, right? Because they're having to walk miles to get water. It's also dangerous, and it prevents quality education as well as economic opportunity. So this is one example of sometimes how girls and women are left out of that gender equality because of another SDG, which is getting water. Now, I brought up my friend Lumbi because she has started a nonprofit in Africa to where she is helping to drill boreholes, or we would call them wells in the United States, to bring running that water into the villages. So women and girls only have to walk 30 minutes one way to get water. So this now allows them to go to school and allows them to get an education. And we can use space technology to help find how to drill those well water. But I wanted to highlight how the SDGs interrelate, because we say, well, water, how is that related to SDG 5? And they're very interrelated. One thing that prevents women and girls from going to school can then create more poverty, which can also create other challenges. So at Space Foundation, we take SDG 5 very seriously. It's one of the things we care about, that and quality education, by creating our kindergarten through 12th grade programs. And one of the key things we've done with that is we call it the Leadership Academy. It's primary school, it's middle school, it's high school. They build upon each other, and they create not just the math and science of going on a space mission. So the primary school is an Earth mission, the middle school is going to the moon, and high school is going to Mars. But it's also about leadership, because what we found is one of the things that women and girls, as well as other underrepresented groups in the space industry, may not have the same opportunities for is leadership. leadership opportunities. It's one of the things that I learned as being in the military. And so we have created that Leadership Academy to create leadership as the foundation, because leadership is the foundation of problem solving, of communication, of inclusivity. And so when we focus this on women and girls around the world, we can now unlock innovation and opportunity. We provide them the opportunity to get an education, which allows them to maybe become entrepreneurs, or get a job, which allows them to earn income, which prevents poverty. And then they can buy better food quality for their families. They can then maybe, with the extra funding, send their children to school, because in most countries you have to pay to go to school. And then again, can we also fund building the well water that will prevent women and girls from having to walk miles to get water? So there's a lot of intersection of how the SDGs work together, and women and girls are part of that fulcrum of unlocking innovation and entrepreneurship, creating economic engines around the world, and harnessing space technology for that. So I look forward to the our other panelists as well as their thought leadership.
Thanks, Shelli. Pat, would you like to add to that? No. I think we cannot hear you. Still muted. Or, yeah, I think we can.
I think Shelli gave a great answer there, and the intersection of the SDGs here is really the clear place to address this question, which is where you have more stable, more prosperous countries, you have better outcomes for women and girls. War, civil collapse, all of these things fall incredibly hard on everyone, but are tilted on one side of the gender spectrum. So we need to think about things like security situations, whether it's internet connections in places like Ukraine or elsewhere or in other conflict zones, whether it's paying attention through geospatial data, through satellite imagery for exploitative industries or exploitative practices, or much darker things that occur in war contexts. A more stable, more prosperous world and economies that are strengthened through space data leads to better outcomes.
Thanks, Pat. And Samira, you have pioneered work and would love to hear from you as a woman what your take is on the question.
I think, so there is two dimensions. One is very personal, because I am a woman in a business that's highly male, both as an economist, but also in the world of analytics and machine learning. Those are very, very male fields. So I think that is just by me existing in a male field, and so is Shelli, that alone already breaks barriers, because there will be younger women saying, look, this is possible, especially if you work highly quant, which is it's still largely associated with men, that logical reasoning, for some reason unknown to me, should be less developed with women. So that is the personal side of my work. But then on the other side, men and women, by society's norms, have different behavioral patterns, whether that's something simple as mobility. So oftentimes you see men and women using transport separately. In the simplest case, it's women oftentimes doing trips of care. So whether that's to drop the children at kindergarten or to do the groceries. So first we have to understand what are the behavioral differences between men and women, and then we can use space to leverage the information to ensure that we also answer those questions that might be different, whether that is something like crops, which might even be in some way more impacting more men because they might be working as seasonal workers, or things like flooding of schools, which might impact more women, because if the school is flooded, children stay at home, and then normally women stay at home to take care of the children. So it starts with understanding how do men and women behave different on the earth, that we can actually then use information from space to answer those questions.
Thank you so much. And sadly, we won't be able to address the remaining questions, but we can go for years talking about this, as we should. Thank you all for joining us today. We sadly have run out of time, but I'd love to thank the panelists, thank the audience for your incredibly rich comments, questions, and to the panelists for your incredible insights. Thank you for joining us today, and I wish you a pleasant morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world.